The gunshot that killed Silas Whitfield echoed across the Wyoming plains on a September morning in 1878, and by the time the sun had fully risen, his widow Bessie Whitfield had already buried him beneath the cottonwood tree behind their cabin, though she could not see the grave she dug. Bessie had lost her sight 3 years earlier, a fever that swept through the small settlement of Willow Creek, taking her vision along with two of her fingers and nearly her life. Silas had stayed with her through all of it, teaching her to feel her way through their small ranch, to know the number of steps to the well, to the barn, to the fence line where the horses grazed. He had taught her something else too, something that would become the stuff of legend across the territory. He had taught her to shoot by sound alone. It started as a way to keep her from feeling helpless. Silas would toss a tin can into the air and Bessie would track its whistle through space, firing at the sound of metal cutting wind, and more often than not, she hit it. Within a year, she could hear a rabbit's heartbeat from 30 paces, or so the men at the saloon claimed, though that was surely an exaggeration born from whiskey and awe. What was not an exaggeration was that Bessie Whitfield, blind as a stone since the fever, could put a bullet through a playing card at 50 yards if someone would only tell her which direction the wind was blowing. Now Silas was dead, shot down by 3 men who had come asking about the deed to the land, men who worked for the Continental Cattle Company, and Bessie was alone. She sat on the porch that evening with Silas's Winchester rifle across her lap, the wood stock worn smooth from years of his hands and now hers. The rifle had been his father's before him, and it never seemed to miss when Bessie held it, not since the day 3 years ago when she had first understood that darkness did not mean helplessness. She ran her fingers along the barrel now, feeling the cool metal, listening to the wind move through the cottonwood leaves where her husband lay buried. "They will come back," she said aloud to no one, because there was no one left to say it to. "They will come back to finish what they started, to take this land the way they have taken every other piece of ground between here and the Powder River." She was right, though it would take 3 days before Marcus Calloway rode onto her land and changed the course of both their lives forever. Marcus was 34 years old, a former Texas Ranger who had drifted north after the war took something out of him that he had never quite gotten back, some capacity for settling into one place and calling it home. He had spent the better part of a decade moving from territory to territory, taking work where he found it, mostly as a hired gun for ranchers who needed protection from rustlers or from the larger cattle outfits that were swallowing up the smaller operations one by one. He had heard about Willow Creek from a man in a saloon in Cheyenne, heard about a widow whose husband had been killed by Continental Cattle Company men, heard too about the blind woman's rifle that supposedly never missed. He had not believed the stories, not really, not until he saw her standing in her yard with that Winchester raised to her shoulder, her pale eyes fixed on nothing and everything at once, as she put 3 bullets through 3 cans that a young ranch hand named Tommy Brennan had thrown into the air in quick succession. Marcus sat his horse at the edge of her property, close enough to see but far enough that he had not yet announced his presence. Tommy was the only other person who worked the Whitfield ranch now, a boy of 19 who had been hired the previous spring to help with the herding, and had stayed on out of loyalty when Silas died, though he was young and green, and no match for armed men who wanted a woman off her land. "That is a fine bit of shooting, ma'am," Marcus called out, walking his horse forward slowly so as not to startle either the woman or the boy who had gone for his own rifle at the sound of an unfamiliar voice. Bessie turned toward the sound, her rifle lowering but not fully relaxing. "Who is there?" "Name is Marcus Calloway." "I heard in Cheyenne that a widow out this way might have need of a man who knows how to handle trouble. I mean you no harm, ma'am, only offering my services if you have work for a hired hand who is good with a gun and better with his word." "We have had enough men come around here with guns," Bessie said, her voice hard as flint. "The last 3 who came onto my land left my husband dead in the dirt." "I am sorry for your loss," Marcus said, and there was something in his voice that made Bessie tilt her head, listening more closely than she had to any voice in a long while. It was not pity she heard, which she had grown so tired of from the townsfolk who visited with casseroles and condolences. It was something steadier, something that sounded like a man who understood loss himself and did not need to make a show of it. "You fought in the war," she said, not a question. Marcus was quiet for a moment. "I did. Fought for the Union, though I was born in Texas and half my kin fought the other side. It is a complicated thing, loyalty, when the land you love and the cause you believe in are not the same thing." Bessie found herself nodding slowly. "Tommy," she said, "put the rifle down. I do not think this man means to shoot us." Tommy lowered his weapon, though he kept a wary eye on the stranger as Marcus dismounted and approached, his boots crunching against the dry September grass. "I cannot pay much," Bessie said. "The ranch has enough money to keep us through the winter if we are careful, but not enough to pay a hired gun what he is worth." "I did not ask about payment, ma'am. I asked about work. There is a difference, and I have found in my years of wandering that sometimes a man needs a reason to stay in one place more than he needs money in his pocket." "And what reason would that be for you, Mr. Calloway?" Marcus looked at her for a long moment, at the way she stood so straight and proud despite everything that had been taken from her, the way her hands held that rifle like it was an extension of her own body. "I have been drifting a long time, Mrs. Whitfield. Maybe I am tired of drifting." That first night, Marcus slept in the barn, insisting that it was not proper for him to stay in the house with a widow woman, even one who could not see him, and Bessie found herself surprised by his consideration for propriety in a land where such niceties were often forgotten. She lay awake in her bed listening to the sounds of the ranch settling for the night, the horses shifting in their stalls, the wind moving through the grass, and beneath it all, the quiet presence of a stranger who had ridden into her life at the exact moment she needed him most, though she was not yet ready to admit how much she needed anyone. The Continental Cattle Company was run by a man named Jasper Reed, a transplant from back east who had come to Wyoming Territory with money and ambition, and very little regard for the small ranchers who had settled the land before the big outfits arrived. Reed wanted the Whitfield Ranch because it sat astride the best water source for 20 miles in any direction, a bend in Willow Creek that never ran dry even in the driest summers, and Reed had already pushed out 6 other small operations in the valley through a combination of legal maneuvering, intimidation, and when those failed, outright violence. Silas Whitfield had been the 7th, and the first to die for his refusal to sell. Marcus learned all of this over the following days, piecing together the story from Bessie's careful, measured accounts and from Tommy's more excitable retelling, and from a visit into town where he heard the gossip at the general store about the widow woman and her uncanny rifle, about the 3 men who had ridden away from her ranch after Silas's death and had not been seen since, though everyone assumed they still worked for Reed and would eventually return to finish the job. "You should know," Bessie told him on his 4th evening at the ranch, as they sat on the porch after supper, "that Reed will not stop until he has this land, one way or another. My husband believed we could hold out, that the law would eventually side with us, but the law in this territory bends whichever way money pushes it. I have dealt with men like Reed before," Marcus said. "They believe that money and guns can buy anything, including justice. Sometimes they are right, more often than any of us would like to admit. But there is always a point where enough people say no, where the cost of taking something by force becomes higher than the men doing the taking are willing to pay." "And how do we make the cost too high for Jasper Reed?" Marcus considered this for a while, watching the sun set behind the mountains in colors that Bessie could not see but could feel in the warmth fading from the air, the particular quality of evening light that even a blind woman could sense against her skin. "We make sure that every time his men come here, they leave knowing this ranch is not worth the trouble." We make sure the whole territory knows it too, knows that Bessie Whitfield's rifle never misses, and that any man who rides onto this land looking for trouble will find more of it than he bargained for." Bessie smiled for the first time since Silas had died, a small, fierce smile that made Marcus's chest tighten with something he could not quite name. "I like the sound of that, Mr. Calloway. Please," he said, "call me Marcus." "Marcus, then, and you may call me Bessie, since we are to be partners in this endeavor of making Jasper Reed's life difficult." Over the following weeks, Marcus made himself useful in ways that went beyond simply being a hired gun. He mended fences that had fallen into disrepair since Silas's death. He helped Tommy with the herding, and in the evenings, he began to teach Bessie things beyond what she already knew about shooting by sound. Things about the land itself, about reading the weather by the smell of the wind, about knowing where danger might be hiding by the sudden silence of birds or the particular way horses grew nervous. But it was Bessie who taught Marcus something in return, something about resilience and hope that he had thought burned out of him during the war and the long years of drifting that followed. She showed him, without ever meaning to teach a lesson, that a person could lose everything and still find a way to stand tall, to keep fighting for what mattered, to laugh at small joys even in the midst of grief and danger. "Tell me what the sunset looks like," she asked him one evening in October, as the days grew shorter and the air carried the first bite of the coming winter. Marcus was quiet for a moment, considering how to describe something he had never thought to put into words before. "It is orange and red and purple all at once, like someone took a paintbrush and was not careful about keeping the colors separate. The clouds catch the light and turn gold at the edges, and right now, there is a hawk circling over the north pasture, black against all that color, like a period at the end of a sentence." "That is beautiful," Bessie said softly. "Silas used to describe things to me too in those first months after I lost my sight. But eventually he stopped, I think because it became too painful for him to see me straining to imagine what I could no longer see myself. I appreciate that you have not stopped, that you still tell me these things. I do not think there is anything painful about sharing beauty with someone who can appreciate it, Bessie, even if the appreciation comes through different senses than my own." Bessie reached out then, her hand finding his where it rested on the porch railing between them, and Marcus felt something shift in his chest, some wall that had been standing for years beginning to crack. "Thank you," she said, "for staying. I have not gone anywhere yet. I know, but I think you could have, and I am glad that you have not." The confrontation with Reed's men came on a cold morning in late October, when 3 riders appeared on the ridge overlooking the Whitfield ranch just as the sun was breaking over the horizon. Marcus spotted them first, his years of training as a ranger giving him an instinct for danger that had kept him alive through countless close calls, and he woke Bessie with a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Riders coming," he said quietly. "3 of them, and I do not think they are here for a friendly visit." Bessie was up and dressed within minutes, her rifle in hand, her face set with the same determination that had carried her through 3 years of blindness and the loss of her husband. "Tommy," Marcus called out to the young ranch hand, who was already stirring in the bunkhouse he had built for himself near the barn. "Get the horses into the corral and stay low. This is not your fight to die in." "It is my fight as much as anyone's," Tommy protested, but he did as he was told, understanding the wisdom in Marcus's caution even as his young pride chafed against it. The 3 riders approached slowly, and Marcus recognized the lead man as one of Reed's enforcers, a hard-faced individual named Dutch Halloran who had a reputation for violence that stretched from Wyoming down into Colorado. "Mrs. Whitfield," Halloran called out as they reined in their horses at the edge of the yard, close enough to be heard but far enough to feel they had some measure of safety. "Mr. Reed sends his condolences for your recent loss and his continued interest in purchasing your land at a fair price." "Mr. Reed's condolences ring hollow," Bessie called back, her voice steady despite the tension in her shoulders, "given that his men are the ones who put my husband in the ground." "That is a serious accusation, ma'am, one that could not be proven in any court of law. I do not need a court of law to know the truth of what happened on my own land." Halloran's eyes shifted to Marcus, taking in his stance, the way his hand rested near his holster, the coiled readiness in his frame that spoke of a man who had faced down worse than 3 cattle company enforcers. And who might this be? Another hired gun looking to die for a lost cause. "Marcus Calloway," Marcus said. "Former Texas Ranger, currently in the employ of Mrs. Whitfield for the purpose of ensuring her continued safety and peaceful possession of her land." "A ranger, is that so?" "Long way from Texas, aren't you, friend?" "Far enough that Texas law does not much concern me anymore, and close enough that Wyoming law does. I suggest you and your companions turn your horses around and ride back to whatever hole Jasper Reed crawled out of, and tell him that this land is not for sale, now or ever." Halloran laughed, a sound without humor. Bold words for a man facing 3 guns to his one. "3 guns to 2, Bessie corrected him, raising her rifle to her shoulder with the same fluid motion Marcus had seen her practice countless times in the preceding weeks, her pale eyes fixed toward the sound of Halloran's voice with an intensity that made even Marcus's skin prickle. "And you should know, Mr. Halloran, that I have not missed a target since I lost my sight 3 years ago. Ask around Willow Creek if you doubt me. Ask anyone in this territory." For a moment, doubt flickered across Halloran's face, the kind of doubt that came from having heard stories he had dismissed as tall tales but was now confronted with the possibility of their truth. His companions shifted uneasily in their saddles, clearly less confident than their leader in the face of a blind woman who spoke with such absolute certainty about her aim. "You are bluffing," Halloran said, though his voice carried less conviction than his words intended. "Would you care to test that theory, Mr. Halloran?" "I promise you, the last thing you will hear is the sound of your own heartbeat, right before this bullet finds it." The silence that followed stretched long enough that Marcus found himself holding his breath, watching Halloran's face for any sign of what he might do next. Then slowly, the enforcer's hand moved away from his gun, and he raised both palms in a gesture of temporary surrender. "This is not finished, Mrs. Whitfield. Mr. Reed does not give up easily, and neither do the men who work for him." "Then perhaps you should find different work, Mr. Halloran, before that stubbornness costs you your life." The 3 riders turned and departed, though not before Halloran cast one final look back at the ranch, his expression unreadable but clearly troubled by what he had witnessed. Marcus lowered his own weapon and turned to look at Bessie, who was still standing rigid with her rifle raised, her whole body trembling now that the confrontation had passed. "You did not shoot," he observed quietly. "I did not need to. Sometimes the threat of a bullet does more work than the bullet itself, if the threat is credible enough." She lowered her rifle finally and let out a shaky breath. "Though I confess, my heart is pounding as though I had run 3 miles. "You handled that better than most soldiers I served with during the war," Marcus said, and there was genuine admiration in his voice. "That took considerable courage, Bessie." "It took considerable trust," she corrected him, "in you standing beside me ready to back my words with action if it came to that. I do not think I could have faced them alone." "You will not have to, not as long as I am here." As autumn deepened into winter, the relationship between Marcus and Bessie continued to grow, though neither of them spoke openly of what was developing between them, both too cautious with their hearts after the losses they had each suffered. Marcus had never married, had never allowed himself to grow close enough to another person to risk the kind of pain that came with loving someone in a land as dangerous and unpredictable as the Wyoming Territory. Bessie, for her part, still carried grief for Sela's alongside whatever new feelings were blooming in her heart, uncertain whether it was disloyal to feel drawn to another man so soon after her husband's death. But the small moments accumulated, building something between them that neither could deny forever. Marcus teaching Bessie to identify different bird calls, information that could prove useful in detecting approaching danger, but that also became a source of quiet joy, as she learned to distinguish the meadowlark from the sparrow, the hawk from the eagle. Bessie teaching Marcus to slow down, to notice the world through senses other than sight, to appreciate the texture of bread dough beneath his fingers, or the particular scent of rain approaching from the western mountains. One evening in November, as the first snow of the season began to fall, Marcus found himself sitting beside Bessie on the porch, both of them wrapped in wool blankets against the cold, watching as the world outside turned white and quiet. "Tell me about your husband," Bessie said unexpectedly. "About Silas. I know only what Bessie has shared with me, but I would like to understand him through your eyes as well, if that does not seem strange." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "He was a good man, though I never knew him myself. But everything you have told me speaks of someone who loved deeply and fought fiercely for what he believed was right. I think if he could see you now, he would be proud of how you have carried on his legacy. Do you think he would be angry if he knew that I have developed feelings for another man so soon after his death?" The question hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable in a way that Bessie rarely allowed herself to be, and Marcus felt his heart quicken at her admission, even wrapped as it was in uncertainty and grief. "I did not know Silas," Marcus said carefully, "but from everything I have learned about him through you, I believe he loved you enough to want your happiness above his own memory. Grief and love are not mutually exclusive, Bessie. You can hold his memory close to your heart and still make room for new feelings, new possibilities. Is that permission you are giving me, Marcus Calloway, or permission you are asking for yourself?" He turned to look at her then, though she could not see the expression on his face, could only hear the slight catch in his breath before he spoke. "Perhaps both. I have not allowed myself to care for anyone in a very long time, Bessie. Not since before the war, when I was young enough to believe that love and safety could coexist in this world. But you have shown me something I thought I had lost the capacity to feel. And what is that? Hope, I suppose. The possibility that even after everything that has been taken from us, we might still find something worth holding onto." Bessie's hand found his in the darkness, her fingers cold from the winter air but her grip strong and certain. "I feel that too, Marcus. I have tried to tell myself it is too soon, that I should honor Silas's memory with more time before allowing myself to feel this way about another man. But my heart does not seem to care about propriety or timing. Then perhaps we should simply allow ourselves to feel what we feel, without judgment or hesitation, and let time reveal where those feelings might lead us." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while longer, watching the snow fall in a landscape that Bessie could not see but could feel in the cold kiss of flakes against her exposed skin, in the particular hush that settled over the world when winter first arrived. When Marcus finally leaned over and pressed a gentle kiss to her temple, she did not pull away, only leaned into him further, accepting the warmth and comfort of his presence beside her. The peace of that winter evening did not last, however, as December brought renewed aggression from Jasper Reed and the Continental Cattle Company. Having failed to intimidate Bessie and Marcus through Halloran's visit, Reed changed tactics, sending word through legal channels that he intended to contest the validity of Silas Whitfield's original land claim, arguing that paperwork filed with the territorial government contained errors that voided the Whitfield family's ownership rights. This news reached them through a letter delivered by the mail carrier, a young man named Charlie Peterson, who made the rounds of the outlying ranches every 2 weeks with correspondence and news from town. Marcus read the letter aloud to Bessie, his voice tight with barely controlled anger as he relayed Reed's legal maneuvering. He claims that Silas never properly filed the amended boundary survey after the creek changed course 5 years ago, which would mean that a significant portion of the water rights technically fall outside your claimed property line. "That is absurd," Bessie said, her hands clenched into fists in her lap. "Silas filed all the necessary paperwork. I remember him riding into Cheyenne specifically for that purpose, spending 3 days away from the ranch to ensure everything was properly recorded." "I believe you, but if the paperwork has somehow gone missing from the Territorial Land Office, or if Reed has influence over the clerks who maintain those records, this could become a serious legal battle, one that requires resources we do not currently possess. What resources would we need? A lawyer, for one thing, someone willing to fight for your rights against a company with Reed's financial backing. That alone could cost more than this ranch is worth in profit for several years. Bessie was quiet for a long moment, considering their options. There is a lawyer in Cheyenne, a man named Thaddeus Morrison, who helped my father with some property disputes back in Nebraska before we moved out here. Silas always spoke well of him, said he was one of the few honest men in his profession. Perhaps if I wrote to him, explained our situation, he might be willing to help, even if we cannot pay his full fee immediately. It is worth trying, Marcus agreed. In the meantime, we should also consider gathering testimony from anyone who might have witnessed Silas filing the original paperwork, or who has knowledge of the property boundaries as they have existed for years. If we can establish through multiple witnesses that the land has always been recognized as belonging to your family, it may help counter Reed's legal challenge regardless of what has happened to the official documentation. They spent the following weeks in a flurry of activity, writing letters to Thaddeus Morrison in Cheyenne, gathering statements from neighboring ranchers and townsfolk who could attest to the Whitfield family's long-standing ownership of the land, and preparing for what promised to be a difficult legal battle, even as they continued to guard against the possibility of renewed physical threats from Reed's hired men. Thaddeus Morrison responded within 2 weeks, agreeing to take the case and travel to Willow Creek personally to review the situation and prepare their defense. He arrived on a bitterly cold day in mid-December, a distinguished-looking man in his 50s with silver hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing as he surveyed the ranch and listened to Bessie and Marcus explain the situation. "Mr. Reed's tactics are not new to me," Morrison said as they sat around the kitchen table, warmed by the fire Marcus had built against the winter chill. "I have encountered similar attempts by large cattle operations to use legal technicalities to force out smaller landowners throughout this territory. The good news is that such tactics often fail when properly challenged, particularly if we can demonstrate a pattern of long-standing recognized ownership." "What do you need from us?" Bessie asked. "Written testimony from as many witnesses as possible, as you have already begun gathering. I will also need to review any documentation you have retained personally, receipts for property taxes paid, records of improvements made to the land, anything that demonstrates continuous ownership and use of the property in question." Marcus produced a small wooden box that Silas had kept locked in a trunk, containing copies of tax receipts and other documents that Bessie had located after her husband's death, though she had not fully understood their significance until now. Morrison spent several hours reviewing the papers, occasionally asking questions that Bessie answered as best she could from memory, while Marcus filled in details he had learned during his weeks at the ranch. By evening, the lawyer seemed cautiously optimistic about their prospects. "This is a strong case, Mrs. Whitfield. I believe we can successfully counter Mr. Reed's claims, though it will likely require a formal hearing before the Territorial Land Office, possibly with testimony from multiple witnesses. I would recommend we schedule this for early spring, once travel becomes easier and we have had time to fully prepare our arguments." "And in the meantime," Marcus asked, "what is to prevent Reed from taking more direct action while this legal process unfolds?" Morrison's expression grew grave. "That, I am afraid, is a concern beyond my expertise as a lawyer. I can fight Mr. Reed in the courts, but I cannot protect Mrs. Whitfield from more immediate physical threats. That responsibility, Mr. Calloway, appears to fall to you." "It is a responsibility I take seriously," Marcus said, his hand finding Bessie's beneath the table in a gesture of reassurance that had become natural between them over the preceding months. After Morrison departed the following morning to begin preparing their legal case, Marcus and Bessie found themselves alone once again, facing the uncertain months ahead with a combination of hope and apprehension. "Do you think we can win this?" Bessie asked as they stood together on the porch, watching Morrison's wagon disappear into the distance. "I believe so, with Morrison's help and the testimony we have gathered, but winning the legal battle may not be enough to stop Reed entirely. Men like him do not easily accept defeat, particularly when there is money to be made from taking what does not belong to them. Then we must be prepared for whatever comes next." "We will be," Marcus promised, pulling her closer against the cold winter wind. Together, Christmas came and went quietly at the Whitfield ranch, marked by a simple dinner shared between Bessie, Marcus, and Tommy, who had become something like family to both of them over the preceding months. Bessie had learned to cook without her sight through years of practice, and the meal she prepared, a roasted chicken with vegetables from their small root cellar, tasted all the better for the warmth and companionship shared around the table. "This is the first Christmas since Sela's passed that has not felt entirely hollow," Bessie confided to Marcus later that evening, after Tommy had returned to the bunkhouse for the night. "I did not expect to feel joy again so soon, but somehow, with you here, the house does not feel so empty." "I am glad," Marcus said, "though I confess I have similar feelings myself. I have spent many Christmases alone in the years since I left Texas, moving from one temporary job to another, never staying anywhere long enough to build the kind of connections that make a place feel like home. This is the first time in a long while that I have felt something like belonging." "Perhaps," Bessie said carefully, "this could become your home if you wished it to be so." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning and possibility, and Marcus found himself reaching for her hand in the darkness of the porch, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear that he had not experienced since he was a much younger man. "Bessie, I have never been the kind of man who speaks easily of his feelings, particularly not feelings as significant as the ones I have developed for you over these past months, but I find myself unable to imagine my future without you in it. I love you, Bessie Whitfield, and I would be honored if you would consider building a life together, as more than employer and hired hand, as more than friends who have grown close through shared circumstance." Bessie's breath caught, tears forming in her sightless eyes as she processed his words. "Marcus, I love you too. I have felt this growing between us for weeks now, though I was afraid to name it, afraid that acknowledging such feelings would somehow betray Silas's memory or prove too foolish given how recently he passed. Grief and love can coexist," Marcus reminded her gently, echoing words he had spoken weeks before. "Silas would want you to be happy, to find joy and companionship even as you honor his memory." "I know that now," Bessie said, "and I am ready to embrace whatever future we might build together if you are certain this is what you want. I have never been more certain of anything in my life." Their first kiss beneath the winter stars was gentle and full of promise, a beginning rather than an ending, the foundation for something neither of them had expected to find again after the losses each had suffered. The following months brought both challenges and joys as Marcus and Bessie navigated their growing relationship, alongside the ongoing threat from Jasper Reed and the Continental Cattle Company. In January, Reed's men made another attempt at intimidation, this time setting fire to a section of fence line at the edge of the Whitfield property, though Marcus and Tommy managed to contain the blaze before it could spread to more significant structures. "This is escalating," Marcus said grimly as they surveyed the damage the following morning, the acrid smell of smoke still hanging in the cold winter air. "Reed is growing impatient with the legal process, testing our resolve while Morrison prepares our case." "Then we must show him that our resolve has not weakened," Bessie replied firmly. "Perhaps it is time to make a more direct statement of our own." 2 days later, Bessie rode into Willow Creek for the first time since Marcus had arrived at the ranch, accompanied by both Marcus and Tommy for protection. though she insisted on demonstrating her own capabilities rather than hiding behind their presence. In the town square, in front of numerous witnesses including several men known to work for Reed, Bessie set up a demonstration that would become legendary throughout the territory. She had Tommy toss playing cards into the air, one after another, and with each throw, she raised her rifle and fired, striking each card cleanly through its center before it could fall to the ground. The gathered crowd watched in amazed silence as she repeated this feat 6 times without a single miss, her pale eyes fixed on nothing visible but her aim absolutely true. "Let it be known," Bessie called out to the assembled townspeople, "that Bessie Whitfield's rifle has not lost its accuracy despite the loss of my sight, and any man who thinks to test that accuracy by threatening my land or my loved ones will find himself sorely mistaken about the ease of such an endeavor." Word of this demonstration spread quickly throughout the territory, exactly as Bessie and Marcus had intended, cementing her reputation as a woman not to be trifled with, regardless of her disability. Reed's men, when they heard the stories, grew increasingly reluctant to volunteer for further action against the Whitfield ranch, understanding now that the tales of her uncanny marksmanship were no mere exaggeration but demonstrated fact. This reputation bought them valuable time as Morrison continued preparing their legal case, gathering additional testimony and researching precedents that would support their claim to the disputed water rights. By February, Morrison felt confident enough in their position to schedule the formal hearing for early April, once winter travel conditions improved sufficiently to allow witnesses to travel safely to Cheyenne for the proceedings. During this waiting period, Marcus and Bessie's relationship continued to deepen, moving from tentative declarations of love toward more concrete plans for their shared future. In late February, on a day when the first hints of spring began to soften the harsh winter landscape, Marcus asked Bessie to marry him. He had planned the moment carefully, wanting it to feel special despite his uncertainty about how to properly court a woman who could not see traditional romantic gestures like flowers or a carefully chosen ring. Instead, he had spent weeks learning from Bessie herself what she found meaningful, discovering that she treasured sounds and textures and the quality of attention someone paid to her rather than visual displays of affection. He led her to the cottonwood tree where Sila's was buried, a place that held significant meaning for both of them. And there, with the sound of the creek flowing nearby and birds calling from the bare branches above, he knelt before her and took her hand in his. "Bessie, these past months with you have shown me a kind of happiness I never expected to find again, after the war took so much from me. You have taught me that strength comes not from what we can see or control, but from the courage to keep moving forward despite our fears and losses. I want to spend the rest of my life learning from you, loving you, building a future together on this land that means so much to both of us. Bessie Whitfield, will you marry me?" Tears streamed down Bessie's face as she processed his words, feeling for his hand and finding it trembling slightly despite his confident speech. "Marcus Calloway, you have given me back my hope, my joy, my belief that life could hold beautiful surprises even after tragedy. Yes, I will marry you with all my heart." Their engagement was celebrated quietly at the ranch, with Tommy serving as an enthusiastic witness to their happiness and promising to stand as best man when they eventually held their wedding ceremony. They decided to wait until after the land dispute was resolved, wanting to begin their married life free from the shadow of legal uncertainty that had hung over Bessie's ownership of the ranch. The hearing in Cheyenne took place as scheduled in early April, with Morrison presenting a compelling case supported by extensive witness testimony, establishing the Whitfield family's long-standing, continuous ownership and use of the disputed land, including the crucial water rights along Willow Creek. Jasper Reed's lawyers argued their technical case about missing paperwork and boundary discrepancies, but the territorial judge, a fair-minded man named Judge Harrison Wells, seemed unimpressed by their attempts to use bureaucratic technicalities to override years of established precedent and recognized property rights. Bessie herself testified during the hearing, her composure and clear-eyed account of her husband's careful attention to proper land documentation impressing the judge and spectators alike. When cross-examined by Reed's attorneys about her ability to accurately recall details given her blindness, Bessie responded with quiet dignity. "My blindness has not affected my memory, sir, nor my understanding of the facts surrounding my husband's proper filing of our land claims. If you doubt my capabilities, I would be happy to demonstrate my continued accuracy with a rifle at 50 paces, though I suspect that particular skill is not relevant to today's proceedings." The courtroom erupted in laughter, and even Judge Wells struggled to maintain his composure, clearly having heard the stories about Bessie Whitfield's legendary marksmanship that had spread throughout the territory over the preceding months. Judge Wells ruled in favor of the Whitfield claim 2 days later, finding that the preponderance of evidence supported continuous, recognized ownership of the disputed land and water rights, regardless of any minor discrepancies in filed paperwork that could reasonably be attributed to administrative error rather than any wrongdoing on the part of the Whitfield family. Reed's legal challenge was dismissed, and the territorial court explicitly recognized Bessie's full ownership rights to the ranch and all associated water access. This legal victory, combined with the growing legend of Bessie's shooting abilities, finally convinced Jasper Reed that further attempts to force the Whitfields off their land would prove more costly than beneficial to his company's interests. Word reached them through various channels over the following weeks that Reed had redirected his attention to other, less well-defended properties in the region, effectively ending the direct threat to Bessie's ranch, though the broader pattern of large cattle operations displacing smaller landowners continued elsewhere in the territory, an injustice that Marcus and Bessie both recognized they could not single-handedly resolve, but could at least ensure did not claim their own home and future. With the legal threat resolved and Reed's aggression redirected elsewhere, Marcus and Bessie finally felt free to plan their wedding without the shadow of ongoing conflict hanging over their preparations. They set the date for early June, wanting to marry when the prairie wildflowers were in full bloom. Even though Bessie could not see their colors, she had grown to love their scent carried on the summer breeze, and Marcus promised to describe every detail of the blooming landscape on their wedding day. The wedding took place at the ranch itself, with the small community of Willow Creek gathering to celebrate the union of two people who had found love and partnership in the face of tremendous adversity. Reverend Thomas Ashford, who had known Silas and Bessie since their arrival in the territory years before, presided over the ceremony, his words emphasizing themes of resilience, renewal, and the unexpected gifts that sometimes emerged from tragedy. Bessie wore a simple blue dress that had belonged to her mother, altered to fit her by the women of the town who had rallied around her in support of this joyful occasion, understanding intuitively that celebrating new love did not diminish the memory of what had been lost, but rather honored the human capacity for healing and hope even after devastating grief. Tommy stood as Marcus's best man, beaming with pride at having played a role in bringing these two people together, having been present since those early days when Marcus first arrived at the ranch and gradually earned Bessie's trust through consistent kindness and unwavering support. As Marcus and Bessie exchanged their vows beneath the same cottonwood tree where he had proposed, promising to love and support each other through whatever challenges the future might hold, Bessie felt a profound sense of peace settle over her heart. She thought of Silas, buried nearby beneath the same tree, and felt certain that he would approve of this new chapter in her life, would want her to embrace happiness and partnership even as she continued to honor his memory. "I know you are watching over us," she whispered silently to her first husband's memory, and I hope you understand that loving Marcus does not diminish what we shared together. It simply means that love, once given the chance to exist, finds ways to persist and grow, even through the darkest circumstances. When Reverend Ashford pronounced them husband and wife, Marcus leaned down to kiss his new bride, and the assembled community erupted in cheers and applause, celebrating not just a wedding but a triumph over the forces that had sought to destroy this small family and take their land through violence and intimidation. The reception that followed was a joyous affair, with neighbors bringing food to share, music provided by a local fiddle player, and dancing that continued well into the evening as the community celebrated alongside the newly married couple. Bessie, guided by Marcus's steady hand, danced for the first time since losing her sight, trusting him completely to lead her through the steps while she focused on the music and the warmth of celebration surrounding them. "This is perfect," she told him during a quiet moment away from the celebration, as they stood together watching the sunset that Marcus described in loving detail, the colors of the sky reflecting the joy and possibility of their new life together. "It is only the beginning," Marcus replied, pulling her close against him. "We have a whole lifetime ahead of us to build something beautiful together, here on this land that has already tested us and proven our strength." In the months following their wedding, Marcus and Bessie settled into married life with the same partnership and mutual support that had characterized their relationship from the beginning. Marcus continued to manage the practical aspects of ranch operations that required sight, while Bessie's expertise in animal husbandry and her legendary shooting skills continued to provide protection and value to their growing operation. Tommy remained with them as a trusted employee and friend, eventually courting and marrying a young woman from town named Sarah Prentice, whom he had met during one of their trips into Willow Creek for supplies. The ranch prospered under their combined stewardship, the water rights that Reed had tried to steal proving as valuable as ever for irrigation and livestock, allowing them to expand their herds and improve the property in ways that Silas himself would have been proud to see accomplished. Marcus proved himself not just capable with a gun but skilled in the broader work of ranching, learning quickly from Tommy and from Bessie's own extensive knowledge, accumulated over years of managing the property alongside her first husband. By the following spring, in 1879, Bessie discovered she was expecting their first child, news that filled both her and Marcus with overwhelming joy and no small amount of nervous anticipation about the challenges of raising a child while managing their busy ranch operation. "Are you frightened?" Marcus asked her one evening as they lay together, his hand resting gently on the small swell of her stomach where their child was growing. "About being a mother despite your blindness?" "I have thought about it considerably," Bessie admitted. "But I have managed to run a household, care for animals, defend our land, and navigate my own life quite successfully despite losing my sight. I believe I can learn to be a good mother in the same way I have learned everything else since the fever took my vision, through patience, adaptation, and the support of people who love me." "You will be a wonderful mother," Marcus said with complete confidence, "and I will be here every step of the way to support you, just as you have supported me through everything since I first rode onto this land." Their daughter was born in November of 1879, a healthy baby girl they named Grace Whitfield Calloway, in honor of both Bessie's maiden name family history, and as a reflection of the grace that had brought them through such difficult circumstances to find happiness together. The birth was attended by a midwife from town, Mrs. Eleanor Hutchins, who marveled at how naturally Bessie seemed to take to motherhood despite her blindness, developing an almost supernatural ability to know when Grace needed feeding or comfort simply through sound and touch. 2 years later, in 1881, their family grew again with the birth of a son, whom they named Silas Calloway, honoring Bessie's first husband whose memory continued to be treasured even as their new family flourished. Marcus had suggested the name himself, understanding that honoring Silas's memory through their son represented not a betrayal of their marriage, but a beautiful acknowledgement of how love could transform and multiply, rather than simply replace what came before. As their children grew, Bessie taught them, as she had been taught herself, that limitations of sight or circumstance need not define what a person could accomplish. Grace, showing an early aptitude for her mother's shooting skills despite having full use of her eyesight, would often practice alongside Bessie, learning to appreciate the discipline and focus that had made her mother's marksmanship legendary throughout the territory. Silas, more inclined toward his father's practical skills with ranch management, spent hours following Marcus around the property, learning the intricacies of cattle breeding and land stewardship that would eventually allow him to take over the family operation when he reached adulthood. The legend of Bessie Whitfield's rifle continued to grow throughout the 1880s, though the woman herself grew more interested in her family and community than in maintaining any reputation for danger or violence. She became known not just for her shooting skills, but for her wisdom and generosity, often called upon to mediate disputes between neighboring ranchers or to offer counsel to other women in the territory facing their own challenges with disability or loss. Marcus, for his part, gradually transitioned from his identity as a hired gun and former Texas Ranger into a respected rancher and community leader, eventually serving several terms as an elected representative to the territorial legislature, where he advocated for fair treatment of small landowners against the continued encroachment of large cattle operations, drawing on his own experience defending Bessie's land against Jasper Reed's aggressive tactics years before. Jasper Reed himself eventually faced consequences for his broader pattern of intimidation and violence against small ranchers throughout the territory, when a coalition of affected landowners, inspired partly by Bessie and Marcus's successful resistance, banded together to bring legal action against the Continental Cattle Company for its systematic pattern of illegal tactics used to acquire land. Reed was ultimately forced to pay substantial restitution to numerous families whose property or livelihoods had been damaged by his company's actions, and the Continental Cattle Company's influence in the territory diminished significantly as a result of this collective legal challenge. Dutch Halloran, the enforcer who had confronted Bessie and Marcus that October morning years before, eventually left Reed's employment after witnessing the growing resistance to the company's tactics throughout the territory, reportedly settling into more legitimate ranch work in Montana Territory, where he was said to have occasionally told the story of the blind widow, whose rifle never missed, as a cautionary tale about underestimating the strength and determination of those who seemed vulnerable on the surface. As the years passed, Marcus and Bessie's ranch became known not just for the legend of her marksmanship, but for the genuine love and partnership that had grown between them, a testament to the possibility of finding happiness and healing even after profound loss and hardship. Their children grew into adulthood, both eventually marrying and starting families of their own, though they remained close to the ranch that had been the site of such dramatic events during their parents' courtship and early marriage. Grace, following in her mother's footsteps, became known throughout the territory as an excellent shot herself, though she never faced the same desperate circumstances that had forced her mother to develop such skills for survival rather than mere sport. She eventually married a young rancher from a neighboring property, and together they took over significant portions of the expanded Whitfield Calloway ranch operation, ensuring that the land Bessie had fought so hard to protect would continue to provide for future generations of their family. Silas, true to his practical nature, expanded the ranch's cattle operations significantly during the 1890s, implementing new breeding techniques he had learned through correspondence with agricultural experts back east, ensuring that the family's herds remained competitive even as the broader cattle industry underwent significant transformation with the arrival of railroad connections and changing market demands throughout the territory. Marcus and Bessie themselves grew old together on the ranch that had brought them together under such dramatic circumstances, their love deepening with each passing year, despite the physical challenges that eventually came with aging. Bessie's shooting skills, remarkably, never diminished even as she grew older, and local legend held that she could still hit a target by sound alone well into her 60s, though she used this skill less frequently as the territory grew more settled and peaceful, the wild frontier days of their courtship gradually giving way to a more established, civilized community. In quiet moments during their later years, sitting together on the same porch where Marcus had first proposed marriage, they would often reflect on the journey that had brought them together, the tragedy that had claimed Silas Whitfield's life, but had also, in its aftermath, created space for a new love to grow and flourish. "Do you ever wonder," Bessie asked Marcus one evening in 1895, as they listened to their grandchildren playing in the yard, the ranch having grown to include not just their own children's families, but a thriving community of relatives and friends who had settled nearby over the years. "What might have happened if you had never ridden onto this land that September morning so many years ago?" Marcus considered the question seriously, as he always did with matters of importance to his wife. "I believe fate has a way of bringing together those who are meant to find each other, Bessie. Perhaps if I had not come when I did, some other path would have eventually led us to this same place, this same love that has sustained us through everything we have faced together. But I am grateful beyond words that I did not have to discover that alternate path, that I found you exactly when I did, and that we have had all these years together to build this life, this family, this legacy." "I am grateful too," Bessie said, reaching for his hand with the same certainty she had shown that first confrontation with Halloran so many years before, though now her touch spoke not of danger and defiance, but of deep, abiding love and partnership. "You saved this ranch, Marcus, but more than that, you saved me, gave me reason to believe in hope and joy again after I had lost so much. You saved yourself, Bessie. You had already proven your strength and capability long before I arrived. I simply had the privilege of standing beside you as you continued to demonstrate that strength, and the honor of building a life with someone as remarkable as you." Their story became something of a legend throughout the territory, told and retold in various forms as the wild frontier days gradually gave way to the more settled communities of the early 20th century. The tale of the blind widow whose rifle never missed, and the former Texas Ranger who rode onto her land and found not just work but love and purpose, became a beloved piece of local history, shared by parents to children as an example of resilience, courage, and the transformative power of love, even in the face of devastating loss and danger. Bessie Whitfield Calloway passed away peacefully in 1912, at the age of 68, surrounded by her husband, children, grandchildren, and even several great-grandchildren who had gathered at the ranch as her health declined in her final months. Marcus, though devastated by the loss of his beloved wife after 34 years of marriage, found comfort in the knowledge that they had built something extraordinary together, a legacy of love and resilience that would continue through their descendants for generations to come. He survived her by only 3 years, passing away in 1915, and was buried beside her beneath the same cottonwood tree where Silas Whitfield had been laid to rest decades before, and where Marcus had proposed marriage to Bessie on that cold February evening in 1879. The 3 graves beneath that tree, representing the complex, beautiful history of love and loss that had shaped this small piece of Wyoming Territory, became something of a local landmark, visited occasionally by descendants and by curious travelers who had heard the legendary story of the blind widow whose rifle never missed and the man who had come to fight beside her, only to find his own heart captured in the process. The ranch itself continued to thrive under successive generations of the Whitfield Calloway family. The water rights that had once been the subject of such fierce contention, now simply an accepted, valued part of the property that had passed down through the family for generations. Visitors to the region, even into the modern era, could still hear locals tell the story of Bessie Whitfield's incredible marksmanship, of the love story that had blossomed amid danger and adversity, of the way courage and resilience had triumphed over greed and violence in the wild, frontier days of the Wyoming Territory. In the end, their story became not just a tale of romance in the Wild West, but a testament to the enduring human capacity for hope, resilience, and love, even in circumstances that might have broken lesser spirits. Bessie Whitfield had lost her sight but never her vision for what her life could become, had lost her first husband to violence but had found her way to a second, equally profound love with a man who recognized and celebrated her strength rather than seeing her disability as a limitation. Marcus Calloway had wandered for years, uncertain of his place in a world still healing from the wounds of war, until he found in Bessie and her fight for justice a purpose worth fighting for, a home worth building, a love worth cherishing for the rest of his days. Their legacy lived on not just in the land they had protected and the family they had built, but in the countless stories told throughout the territory of the blind widow's rifle that never missed, and the love story that had unfolded alongside that legendary marksmanship, proving that even in the harsh, unforgiving landscape of the American frontier, love could find a way to flourish, to heal, and to endure against all odds.